A very warm welcome to all of you. So lovely to see so many joining us this morning here in Copenhagen from around the world. We're very excited to see that you are interested in this topic that we have worked on for the past about a year. And the launch of our policy brief and our film this morning. The film is called Somehow She's Managing, and we are excited to have our world premiere at this webinar. My name is Signe Plambeck. I'm an anthropologist and senior researcher at the Danish Institute for International Studies, and I'm the principal investigator of this project, working with wonderful colleagues in Denmark and Nepal on this project. In the next hour, we will present some of our findings. And first, I will give a short intro, followed by a presentation by our researcher here at the Danish Institute for International Studies, Sofie Henriksen. Then we will screen our short film, and then we are very happy to have Dana Orr with us from Nepal, who is the technical coordinator for protection, gender and inclusion at the Danish Red Cross in Nepal, and she will give her important insights from Nepal. So climate change is one of the largest contributions to loss of livelihoods, as many of you probably know, in a range of sectors in the global south and also elsewhere. We know that slow onset climate change like droughts and sea level rises, as well as sudden onset disasters caused by climate change, have gendered effects and affect men and women differently. But while climate crisis research has focused to some extent on gender and mobility and migration, it is not so often linked to linking these issues together at the same time. For instance, looking at the precarious situation of women migrants, their role in migrant families, and as we shall see later, also for the women who stay behind when men are migrating. So these are often overlooked aspects of climate change scholarship. We found when looking through the existing scholarship that has obviously been produced a lot of climate change scholarship over the past years, but we were trying to link labor, mobility and gender in this project. The little policy and research on women, migration, labor and climate crisis that are trying to connect this have globally often focused on the agricultural sector, but many women actually migrate rural to urban or otherwise from poverty-ridden areas to work in the tourist service sectors as hotels, restaurants, wellness, and also into sex work. In some areas shifting from agricultural work to working in the local tourism industry, where working in the local tourist industry might be the only alternative to transnational migration. So these are some of the existing findings on a more global level. And further, we also found that when there is a focus on women and climate crisis globally, it is often in highly sensational news stories and reports suggesting that climate change leads to increases in sexual violence and trafficking and sex work. And that actually spurred some of our initial why we wanted to focus on this project was these anecdotal evidence and talks about the interlinkage between sexual violence, exploitation, migration, and climate change. And this debate we found is often repeated in policy and media language on global crisis in general, that when we have a global crisis or climate crisis in this case, it will lead to a gendered exploitation or to trafficking in the context of migration. But however, knowledge about the impact of climate change on increases in exploitation, human trafficking, and sexual violence rests mainly on little evidence and also very fragmented around the globe. And such easily drawn conclusions about migration, labor exploitation, gender violence as a result of climate change is very evident from the work that we have been doing. It needs to be probed with further research and look into ways that these things are connecting and how climate crisis might amplify already existing sites and situations of gendered violence and exploitation, so that we do not become consumed, you can say, with the newness of the climate crisis and not seeing structural or cultural issues which has long trajectories in local communities. And as you will see later, that was certainly the case when we, with our colleagues, looked into the situation in Nepal. So we wanted to move away from simplified presumptions and set out to explore the overall research question: what happens to women's work and mobility under conditions of climate change? And the project builds on some of the research that do exist, in particular examining women, migration, and climate change through an intersectional approach. This means we wanted to look at how intersecting forms of inequality, such as gender, class, and in this case also caste, came to shape everyday life of the women we were interviewing. And furthermore, we focused on migration, but also on mobility as a concept to explore the gendered aspects more dynamically, such as how do men and women's mobility intersect and shape one another, and how might gendered and cultural norms play part under conditions of climate change. So these were some of the initial ideas we wanted to explore. And we did this in, we initiated a collaboration with the Danish Red Cross, who as a humanitarian organization are facing these realities in their daily work across the globe. And they opened up a collaboration with their colleagues in Nepal, so that we decided, all of us, to have this as a case study, as a pilot study, to look at how these issues are connecting in the context of Nepal. So the webinar is based on the pilot study called Climate Change, Migration and Women's Work. And it's a collaboration between the Danish Institute for International Studies, the Danish Red Cross, with assistance from the Nepal Red Cross Society and funded by the Danish Red Cross. So I want to thank them for their generous support and the collaboration over this year. And we hope certainly that we can continue our conversations on how to put these findings into practice. I also, on behalf of Sofie, who is the other principal investigator on this project, want to thank our collaborating master students and research assistants, Benedikte Raft and Collier Dahlin. And now I will pass the word to Sofie, who will present some of our initial findings on the project. Thank you. And maybe I should mention that you can write questions during the webinar and we will take them at the end. Thank you.
Okay, I hope everyone can see a slideshow now. Yes, I will just go back to the beginning. Okay, so thank you, Sine, and thank you everyone for joining this webinar. My name is Sophia, and I was part of this study, and I'm very excited today to share some of the key insights based on this study and this policy brief that we produced. So as Sina has just described, our initial interest in this was how to get a little bit at a better understanding of how climate change intersects with migration and gender, and also to understand what happens to women's labor and mobility under conditions of climate change. So to answer this question, we first conducted a literature review of, okay. Sorry, I think maybe it's not in slide mode. 1 second. Okay, sorry about that. I will try one more time and share my screen. I hope this is better. Okay. Okay. Okay, I hope this is better. If not, please let me know in the chat. Okay, I will just go from here, and I hope you guys can see it. Yeah, so we did this review of literature, which highlighted a need to move away from understanding migration, gender, and climate change as isolated issues, and instead towards an intersectional perspective that considers how these issues are linked globally and locally. And a key part of this was also recognizing that climate change doesn't necessarily cause migration, as has been sort of the dominant narrative before, but it can amplify some mobility patterns and vulnerabilities related to migration. Then we also conducted a fieldwork in the Madhesh Province of Nepal. And here we visited 2 municipalities in the Danish district and interviewed 19 women living there. And as I hope you can see on this map, this shows a map of Nepal and where the Madhesh region is in the south of Nepal, and also the Danish district. So we chose this location in close collaboration with our partners in the Danish Red Cross in Nepal, because this province exemplifies a very complex web of gendered, socioeconomic, and environmental risk factors. So for example, the province is located in the lowlands of Nepal, and it's really vulnerable to floods that are occurring increasingly in this region. But it's also the province in Nepal where international labor migration is most common. However, it's almost only men who engage in this type of migration. So it was only 4% of the international labor migrants are women. And so it was clear to us that, thank you, Emilia. Okay, thank you. Yes. Yeah, okay. So it was clear to us that climate change, migration, and gender inequalities were really entangled and prevalent issues in this region. And so in this presentation today, I'm going to focus on 3 key findings from this study. And the first one is that men's international labor migration leaves women to navigate the local and everyday effects of climate change. So the women we interviewed described how changing weather patterns, such as more frequent and longer droughts, but also more erratic and extreme rainfall, made it much more difficult to grow their own crops, which they relied on for food. And therefore, they increasingly needed money to buy the food that they would have otherwise grown themselves. But at the same time, the changing weather also made it more difficult to earn money because these women often relied on day labor in the fields to generate a small income. So when the harvest would fail, there were fewer options for work. So this highlighted to us that poverty was sort of a root source of vulnerability that was amplified by climate change, rather than climate change creating all of these vulnerabilities in isolation. And the women were also left to manage the effects of sudden onset disasters, such as floods, which meant that in the occurrence of a flood, they were responsible for moving their families to a new safe location, or rebuilding their houses if they were damaged or destroyed. But despite of this, the women that we spoke to, they said they often didn't speak about these changes as climate change, and they would often tell us that they didn't know anything about climate change, even though it was really obvious that they were navigating these changes on a daily basis. So this highlighted to us the need to look at the more local and everyday effects that are hiding behind this global phenomenon that we all talk about as climate change. And so, as Sina also pointed out, instead of focusing narrowly on the people who actually move across borders, which in this case would be the male migrants that are traveling from this region to Qatar or Saudi Arabia or other countries where they are exposed to these extremely harsh and dangerous working conditions that we hear more and more about, we focused on the women that are staying behind. And by doing that, we could see that global migration creates links between migrants' horrible working conditions in the Gulf states and women's labor and climate change in Nepal. And this leads to the next finding we want to highlight today, which is about the economic links that are created through debt and remittances that the men send home from their labor abroad. So out of the 19 women that we interviewed, 15 of them had husbands and or sons that were currently abroad or had previously been abroad for work. And these men had all left due to a lack of work opportunities in Nepal, and remittances had become a crucial source of income for the women and their families. These remittances were first and foremost used to buy food and medicine and other household items that were needed on a day-to-day basis. And most of the women mentioned that the remittances they were receiving were barely enough to secure these daily expenses. But other families also used remittances to invest in more long-term climate adaptation practices, such as saving up for a water pump or building stronger houses that were safe, that were elevated from the ground and safer during floods. And some families would also purchase metal stoves, portable metal stoves that they could use to cook on when there was a flood, in contrast to clay stoves that were placed on the ground. But almost all of the women that we spoke to mentioned that they primarily used remittances to pay off their family's debt. Oftentimes, these families had debt that came from financing the husband's migration, but also from paying marriage dowries, which is a cultural tradition that is still practiced in this part of Nepal, where the bride's family is expected to pay a large sum of money or expensive gifts to the groom's family. But the fact that remittances are so often used to pay off debt leaves these women really extremely vulnerable when the remittances stop. And unfortunately, the remittances do quite often stop, especially for the women whose husbands or son are injured or even die while working abroad. So the statistics show that between 2008 and 2022, more than 10,000 Nepalese male migrants died while working abroad. And 5 of the women that we spoke to had husbands or sons that had become critically ill or died or disappeared abroad. So in these tragic cases, the women could no longer rely on the remittances, and they were also left to pay off the debt on their own. So while labor migration, remittances, and loans are used as adaptation strategies and ways to manage poverty and a lack of jobs, these solutions create really big risks and vulnerabilities for both for the men leaving, but certainly also for the women staying behind. And this links up to the third key insight from our study, which is about the role of gender and the gendered differences in mobility. Because as I mentioned earlier, women very rarely migrate from this region of Nepal internationally. So out of the 19 women that we spoke to, only 1 had migrated abroad for work. In all the other cases, the women felt like migration was not a possibility for them, mainly due to a lack of education or the burden of childcare responsibilities, but also because of gendered and social expectations. Because in this particular part of Nepal, women do not have unlimited freedom of movement, but they are expected to be accompanied by their husbands or other male family members when they go out or leave their houses. So when their husbands are gone, these women's mobility was even further restrained. And leaving their houses without a husband exposed these women to social stigma, while staying at home exposed them to isolation and few opportunities to generate an income. So when we wanted to understand the link between migration and climate change, it was important to also understand the uneven patterns of mobility in this region, and to include a perspective of how the mobility of the male migrants is linked to and in some ways contribute to amplify the immobility of some women. However, we also really want to stress that while these women face really big challenges, they are not powerless. And when we say that they are immobile in comparison to their husbands, we are not trying to say that they are passive or in any way helpless. As we will also see in the short film in a little bit, they're all somehow managing these incredibly difficult or increasingly difficult living conditions, and while dealing with all of their household and childcare responsibilities, missing their husbands and sons or mourning their deaths, these women show impressive resilience and strength as household leaders. So understanding the vulnerabilities and risks also means recognizing these women's power and strength as they navigate the everyday effects of climate change. And this is something that we have tried to do throughout our study, and especially also in the film. So I'll end here. And since this was only a pilot study, we still have plenty of open-ended questions and unresolved questions, but based on these very initial findings, we want to join a growing debate in research and policy about the interconnectedness of climate, migration, and gender, and show that these issues should be addressed together and with an intersectional perspective. So the next step for us is to dive into many more of these issues, but also in collaboration with the Red Cross, try to gain an understanding of how a humanitarian organization can support the women and families that are impacted in this nexus. And so hopefully our study can be part of that conversation. So I'll pass it back to Sina now, who will introduce our short film, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Sophie, for introducing our topic. And we are, of course, well aware that there are so many more things to dive into. I think as being a migration researcher for many years, it was quite interesting for me to see that the focus on remittances that we have had over these many years, and also on women, migrant in general, it was quite interesting to see how the money or the remittances used were now going into climate adaptation. And I think that's something, I mean, there are several of our findings that I think are key, but these are one of the things that I think we should really look more into, how the monies, the remittances are now spent in receiving, or in the communities that are financing their daily lives through remittances, how humanitarian organizations in general and through policies can help sustain, so that it's not the burden of migrant families to do the climate adaptation through remittances. But let me now introduce the film and a few words about the film. Through the collaboration with Red Cross, we wanted to not only do a written output, but also a more visual output that can reach broader audiences in the sense of other NGOs, other organizations, other interested people, policymakers, not only in Nepal, but also maybe be shared in other settings, to see as a pilot how the situation is in Nepal and learn from that. It's filmed during the fieldwork in Nepal, and we wanted to give the word to the women themselves so that they could explain how they see the situation. And so this is the world premiere. So welcome to the world premiere of Somehow She's Managing.
Yeah,
Everyone is saying the same thing. Climate disasters with intensity that has never been seen before are piling up faster than ever.
Hundreds of acres of land underwater, thousands of houses damaged by the floods. Floods caused by incessant rains that started on Friday have destroyed much of these fertile plains of Nepal.
बाहर अभी तक साल भर से नहीं वर्षा भेले से के तो रौदिये पड़ गेली वर्षा हो लगी है तो बाहर चल ये घर बनल तो से नहीं बाहर हल ये घर बनल तो नहीं बाहर हल वो घर सबने पानी घर सबने ढुक जाए नहीं हो होते रहे गाँव में जाले भगे छे ताले रोड पर सब डूब जाए अब गेली तो 2-4 दिन 10 दिन रहली फिर एली तो थालों में थाल सब रही पानी सब रही वो पछली खाना उना बना के फिर खैली तो रहली बाढ़ के चलते कहली बाढ़ फिर जाही ने तो बाढ़ चल भी तो समस्या भ जाए है हमार घर वाला रहे विदेश सबूत भी रहे छथिन घर परिवार में रहे छी अपने हम अथी 5-6 साल भ गेलखिन गेला बुझलखिन बौआ सबके चलते आब छपरानी के पे खर्चा भेले घरे नहीं कमौटी हुई है से बुझाई दे बेटी भी तक का बाहर प्रदेश नहीं जाए है घर में खर्चा नहीं पूरी है पढ़ाई लिखाई में खर्चा लगी है कपड़ा मान के जोड़ पर खर्चा लगी है बेटा धन के अपन कमेते अपन खर्चा जोड़ते अपन पूरा जोड़ते कहीं बापू मतारी के देखते तो दूसरे तकलीफ तो बुझाए है बेटा बेटी में फर्क भ जाए है पैसा पठबी है 40,000 30,000 तो कुछ महाजन के लिए किस्ता उठने चिका बुझा बेटी के शादी कैली उनका देवा में लाइली कर्जा बर्जा तो उनके कर्जा बर्जा के डेली घर में खर्चा खैली फिर चावल कीन के दाल कीन के सब कुछ कीन के खेत पथार नहीं हिंदी दी बुझल के कतनो बचबे तो घर परिवार तो बच्चा सब भेजे तो कहबे कली ना बेटी 5 गो तो बेटा धन रहती तो कहो से कमैते 2 गो आमदनी होती 3 गो आमदनी होती बेटी है तो नहीं आमदनी 1 गो आमदनी है तब एगो बेटी है जमाई है फिर अबियो 10 गो रुपये रहते 4 गो बेटी है जवान तो ओकरा लगे कहाँ विदेश जबी कमाए बाहर जी कमाए जबी थी घर सब है फिर लोग सब घर सब ने कहीं समस्या भ जाए है गाँव घर में गेला ताला मारला से घर गिर पड़ते फिर उतने बान्हा जबे हस्बैंड के अखनी गेला 2.5 साल बीत गया कथी कहे कि तंदूरी रोटी बनावे है कमल के पड़े जब ये रोटी कर ले तो बाल बच्चा भूखे पड़े अपने भूखे पड़े से नहीं गिरवत के उपजाते तो देता है नहीं देते और कथी कहे गिरहत के उपजाते तो दूर हुआ देते से गिरहत के कोनो चीज बाली होते कोनो चीज होते तब ना हमरा कहते जन्म जाइला तब ना जबे तो ओकरा धुआ देते हमरा आ नहीं होई तो ओहने रह जाय छी दिक्कत बहुत दिक्कत में दिक्कत काम भेटे छले मतलब सब बाग गेल ते समय ते साल धान तान में उपजल तो एक ठाव से दोसर गांव जाकर जेना मंगराहा में नहीं बाढ़ ढुकले तो मंगराहा में जाकर एकर बन के पयान के घर में बाल बच्चा के खिली छले देख रेशन के लिए 9 जवान रहना तो कहले नहीं कमी भी तो शादी बाहर के ना हेते के चलते घर से कहीं देरी करी जाओ कमाओ तो नंदी के ब्याह करो खाना खाता तो कोनो कुछ करे तो काम घर में हंसते आ बाहर जगह से पैसा कमा के लोग शादी बात करबे तो कोई नहीं हंसते के चलते सब भराती भेजा देली कमाई लो ना 3-4 लाख रुपया बाकी है और समूह सबसे लेने छिए और गाँव में लेने छिए ननद के शादी के लिए ना तो वही कर्जा कर शादी के लिए तो शादी केला के बाद में 2 साल भी तो सैध गए 10 लाख रुपया तक छे लोन तो सैध गए आरो 5 लाख तक फिर नहीं बनिए लागल घर छोड़ के हमरा से बच्चे नहीं के बहुते दुखित में 10 दिन 5 दिन कल्ले खेजली जे घर वाला छोड़ के चल गेल गा रही तो घरे त दोनों व्यक्ति रहती कमाती खेती गाँव घर में, लेकिन गाँव घर में कमेला से नहीं फर्क कर लेता भेजा ले। बोलू ना खाना पीना हो गया कहाँ से तो और सब सुनो की करबे गरीबी जीवन तक काटे पड़ले ना केनो को। और बउआ के तबीयत खराब हो गई कनी छोटू के। मतलब सब पढ़ल लिखल नहीं छे तो विदेश नहीं जा सके छे, पढ़ल लिखल रहती तो विदेश जाती कोनो भाषा बुझती आ नहीं छी पढ़ल लिखल तो नहीं बोलू जाए के इच्छा है बोलू से पढ़ल लिखल रहती तो जैती बोलू पढ़ल लिखल रहती तो जैती मतलब सब कमाती विदेश में कोई गांव में रहती सब दीदी सबके संग भाई रहती मतलब सब बहुत दुखित आत्मा अल हो से नहीं कथू भैया नहीं कथू बच्चे बाल बच्चा पढ़े लिखे नहीं कथू बन सके छे कोनो देश कमाई जैती तो वो सब कुछ मुझ लेती पैसा पैसा कमा कर तो कुछ कह सकती करती।
Okay, and now I think we will welcome a Q&A session with Dana from the Red Cross in Nepal. If you can put your...
Namaste.
Okay, so Dana, thank you so much for joining our webinar today, and to everyone listening, I just want to introduce Dana as she was part of our field research team in Nepal. So she was a very big help for us in both gaining the access and with all the practical help during this research. But today she's here as an expert on protection, gender, and inclusion. And we will ask you a couple of questions about this topic so you can share some of your knowledge. But first, I want to just go back to the film that we just saw. And when you hear the stories of these two women that we see in the film, what do you think are some of the most important lessons that we can learn from these stories and from these women?
Thank you so much, Sophie. Actually, the film showed the live example of the woman in Madhesh Province whose husband are migrated in another country and how they are struggling and spending their life alone at home, taking care of children and their household responsibility. And the film also underscored the live example how the climate change intersect migration and gender inequality. So here in the film, we all know that migration is the global issue and climate change one of the major pulling and pushing factor for the migration because of migration and the extreme weather scenario, people face very complicated life. Then the sudden desire to move in safe place for safety, save their life and livelihood. And then they quick decide to internal displacement and sometimes migrate in another external as well. So in some part, climate change also affect in agriculture productivities. When it affect in agriculture and the agriculture district, then they thought the other option for income generation and good opportunity for economic, then they also decide to migration. So that's why migration is the one of the, climate change is the one of the driving factor for migration. Thus, in this scenario, when we see the Nepal's context, in our scenario, the census data 2021 showed that 2.2 million are migrate. That means 7.4 population of total population are abroad. And among them, 18% are women. And 83.3% are men. So when we see the Madhesh, where we conducted this study, the Madhesh province is the largest number of migrants, and because of the climate change and other factors. And one thing is that the migrant number is largest in Madhesh province, but when we see the women migrant, it is very minimal because of traditional rule and restriction, norms and value of their society. So in this scenario, the climate change, migration affect different people differently. We also seen in the video because of their role and responsibility, power balance, access to information, access to technology, access to education and resources and opportunity, and sometimes decision-making role also. So in that part, who became more vulnerable? Obviously, women, children, person with disability, and girls. When we see the migration scenario, climate change related migration scenario, in this film and in reality also, there are positive and negative effect of the migration. First of all, I would like to share the positive impact how in women because of the migration. When their husband migrated in another country, they became alone and they step out and engage in challenge the traditional role, because their traditional role is limited them inside the home and household tasks. But after their husband's migration, they engage in community and social events, and they engage in CBOs, and they engage in group community group saving and credit group, informal and formal group. And sometimes they also empowerment them to make decision either inside the home and public sphere as well. That's the good point. And another is they become economically empowerment. How? When they receive the remittance, they spend the remittance in their self-development, skill development. Sometimes they spend the money in their children's education. Sometimes they spend their money in the further income generation part. And they also make decision independently. That's also another positive point. And sometimes their education investment also make them empowerment, and that's the positive point. And however, there are some negative point as well, like they increase the additional work burden, and sometimes they face social stigma, because in Madhesh community, when go mobility.
I think we have some technical issues here. Dana, if you can hear us, could you turn off your camera maybe? Sina, is it only me who cannot hear Dana, or?
No, I cannot hear. I I cannot hear her either.
Okay.
Okay, let's in the meantime, let's start to maybe answer some of the questions and then hope that Dana can join us again. So one of the questions that we had is, I like the focus on structures and culture and not getting too occupied with the newness of climate change and looking through kind of the old, what I touch upon in my introduction, that we have to look some of the older trajectories as well. So in terms of newness, do you mean more so in terms of the bigger, newer focus it has in the development sector and not so much in terms of its new emerging crisis, presumably? And here I, of course, want to emphasize that it's primarily this focus in the development sector, which I attended to, that I think we should be aware of how we talk about women in the climate crisis as not only affected, that it's not only questions about exploitation and trafficking, but that there are other much more complex issues involved. But now Dana is back and we can see her
my
again.
internet
So
is disconnected. Sorry for that.
no problem.
That's why there is economic burden and sometimes social stigma faced by them. Sometimes alone household responsibility, a single parent, being a single parent, there are so many anxiety and mental stress facing by them. Beside that, there are one of the climate change and migration also affect the early marriage in Madhesh community, because when the family face economical problem, at the time they not entertain to send their daughter to the school. Instead of sending school, they push them for early marriage. And sometimes dowry system is another more challenging factors, because when the people migrate, the expectation of the groom's family demands increased. And at that time also in the film also, the Aruna also said that they faced sometimes dowry. Because of dowry, her husband is outside and she is facing still repaying the debt of the dowry. Such kind of,
and actually this is maybe something that you could explain to us a little bit more about, because it's touched upon in the film and also in our policy brief, but of course there's so much more to this that you will be an expert on. So maybe tell us a little bit about why it's important in the Nepalese context, or maybe even more specifically in the context of this province, to focus on gender if we want to understand the effects of climate change. So maybe give us a little more information on what are some of these gendered norms and cultural norms that are intersecting with climate change in this region.
Yes, I already said that the migration and all affect the different people differently, and that in that time women became more vulnerable because of the norms. In their societal norms and societal structure, although they define men's role as a breadwinner, and women are limited in the inside the home. And because of the climate change, women have increased work burden. Because, for example, when the drought occurs at that time, they need to go long away to fetch the water. That's also time consuming. And sometimes the migration, when their husband migrated in another country, they also face alone role as responsibility. And sometimes this also affect them. This also push them for further risk of the gender-based violence, social stigma, and sometimes they also criticized by community, and that create mental stress. I have already shared that. And sometimes there is women are not quite aware about the where to report the cases and how to report the cases. And sometimes they did not know they did not know access to service of the such kind of things. That's why they are excluded by the access to information, opportunity, service, and other education that limited for mobility and that also limited to cope with the critical scenario. And that's why we need to focus to the woman, because the climate affect to all, but because of the existing gender inequality, women become more vulnerable than others.
So yeah, so you're saying that we need to focus more on the women because they have some very specific vulnerabilities in this context. So from the perspective of a humanitarian organization that you're part of, what do you think are some important ways to support these women and their families? And perhaps you could both talk about this as what are some short-term solutions and maybe some more long-term strategies that you could look at.
Yeah, Red Cross is working in humanitarian sector for a long time, and we are more focusing because PGI is our high priority. Protection, gender, and inclusion is our high priority, where we also applied community engagement and accountability. It's our sole approach to ensure the meaningful participation of women and marginalized groups. And one thing is that, another is, I have already shared several issues related to the woman. But to address the issue, first of all, we need to make a gender responsive program and policy. There are some policy already existing, but in implementation part, there is lacking. We are advocating on that part, evidence-based advocacy. And sometimes we also supporting the government body in terms of capacity building, in terms of policy establishment, in terms of institutionalization part as well. And we not only we limited till the government, we also enhance the capacity of community by the comprehensive community engagement tools and techniques. That means, first of all, we map the active network of women, children, persons with disability, which are existing in the community. And then after mapping them, we capacitate them by different types of tools, by game, sometimes by film, by sometimes interaction. We continuously engage them in our activities and aware about the policy, about the climate change, about the certain scenario, and also aware them how to raise their voice in local planning process. In that types, we engage our comprehensive engagement package, tools and techniques aware to the community so that they become aware. But it's not sufficient, but we are trying continuously because of we have also limited some fund barriers, and sometimes we can't cover the all part, but we are doing as much as possible as our effort.
Thank you, Dana. I think we are almost running out of time. So perhaps we should take a few more questions from the audience, but thank you so much for sharing this, Dana.
Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much. So we have some great questions, and I think the two first of them maybe is directed to Sophie, because they relate to some of the women that you spoke with in the study. And the first question is, you mentioned that women don't speak about climate crisis, but of other things, local change. I wonder how they see the repeating issues of flooding, drought, landslides, and their reflection on this. Any long-term planning on the women's side, or more responding to immediate issues? Is that something you could maybe address, Sophie, how they talk about long-term and short-term, the women in the study?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something that we actually spent some time also reflecting on while we were in the field, because as I said, the women were definitely aware that something was changing in terms of weather patterns, but also the work opportunities for work in the fields. And so they were describing all of these changes to us. But then when we would ask them, so what do you think about climate change, or how do you experience climate change? They would say, no, I don't know anything about that. And so we found it quite interesting that they were so obviously navigating these changes on a daily basis, but they were not engaging in this big debate about climate change that we are. And so many of them had, you could say, ideas for long-term strategies that they would like to have, such as build a house, build a stronger house, or invest in a water pump, or invest in some more modern technology that could help them be safe during these changing weather patterns. But most of them actually struggled just to get by on a daily basis. So it wasn't that they were lacking long-term ideas or plans, but it was just that the short-term needs were so immediate and they were really difficult for them to meet. So it was like the short term was just consuming all of the resources that they had.
Thank you. I think the next question, maybe Dana could help us reply to that. As a person is asking, have you found any changes in the dowry custom, reduction or increase in amount, early marriage, whether due to climate change or, for example, migration or the head of the household? So the question is if you see any changes in cultural and traditional norms in connection to climate change. Is that something you can help us with, Dana?
In previous scenario, there is little bit changes. Like in some good example, also some youth did not get the dowry system. But when we see the large number of people, there is still occurring the dowry system. When they did early marriage, the early marriage, when they send they force their daughter in early marriage. At the time, they not obligated to provide lots of dowry. That's why, because when the daughter have more education, they also seek the good life partner. At the time, the educated life partner, the rich life partner demands more dowry. That's why they thought that if they send their daughter in early age, they get rid of such kind of burden. That's why there is interconnection between early marriage and dowry system. But in some good practices also, example also seen in this scenario, but in large number of, there is still facing the same kind of problem.
Still the same. We have many questions here, so I unfortunately have to only take a few of them more. Let me see here. We have one question, maybe that's for Sophie as well. Did you find stories where the families could migrate from disaster-prone area because of the remittances from their husbands? So whether the remittances could actually assist the women in migrating?
We did not meet any families with those kinds of stories in our study. And I think that was probably for several reasons. One is that usually these families were very poor and the remittances were not enough for a family to travel anywhere. But then also for some of the other reasons I mentioned, that women in this region, they don't really see it as an opportunity for them to migrate, because if they went somewhere, what would they do? They don't have an education, they don't speak a different language, and so migration didn't occur to them as a strategy for the rest of the family. So in our cases, we did not find stories like that.
Mm-hmm. Then we have one question. I think Dana could attend that, and then I have a final comment. So the question is women's mobility restricted due to migration primarily to Arab country, or is it a matter of cultural norms?
Basically, I have already said that when we see the scenario of the women's migration, you mean women's migration, am I right?
Yes.
Yes. When we see the women's migration in the total Nepal scenario, also there is less percentage, because 83.3% of men and only 18.17% 70% of 7% of women. there is also disparity. And when we see the Madhesh province, Madhesh province have maximum restriction, cultural norms, and that's why they are restricted to mobility. In some case, in my experience, there is also a large number of people migrated to India, but this kind of migration is not counted as per our policy, because the cross border is not counted. But the large number of, when we see this kind of scenario, 88% absentees in Sudur Pasim province are in India, but not counted as a migration. This
That's
kind of
interesting.
scenario.
Okay,
Yeah.
I see.
And
I think
so,
I have to just to make sure that we have one more question. Is that okay? Because we had a question from Ronald Ndissanyo at the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. He posed 3 wonderful questions, and I think, unfortunately, we only have time to answer one of them, and I think maybe Sophie could help us. He is asking, does men's departure and intensified livelihood stress among women at home mean that men are key actors, players, as opposed to women in local climate adaptation? Or is adaptation rather driven by shared efforts between men and women? Sophie, can you help us with that in our study?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. I think well, one thing that we really actually wanted to highlight with this study was how much of it is a shared effort, and how usually when we talk about migration, we look at the people who actually migrate, but this mobility perspective is really helpful for including all of the people involved in a family's migration. So of course, the women that are staying behind and are left with the childcare responsibilities and household responsibilities, they're a big part of migration as climate adaptation strategy. So I think some of what we described here as sort of the everyday effects of climate change, it's very much the women that are dealing with adapting to these changes, such as the difficulties getting work in the fields and rebuilding the houses after floods and moving the families to safer locations. So yeah, I think it's actually one of the points that we want to make in the policy brief and the film is that climate adaptation is very much a shared effort. And even though these women are seen as immobile, they're also active actors in adapting to climate change.
Thank you so much.
I would like to one point.
Of course.
Yes. Regarding currently the mindset is changed, and the discrimination between son and daughter is also decreasing than previous time. And nowadays, obviously you said Arab and other country mobility is high rate. But nowadays, women are also migrated because of the education and dependent and business and some part. And nowadays, women's migration rate is gradually increasing in USA, Australia for education. That's why it's not like only they are limited in other country, and they are also migrated in developed country for education and good opportunity.
To other countries. Okay. So I will just end by a comment. A person is writing, thank you for the heart-touching documentary. I think it's sad. It's a sad case of how climate change exacerbates gender vulnerability. I could see clearly how changing climate and lack of awareness on climate change. I also think it's important to create an intergenerational disparity, or to look at the intergenerational disparity and additional vulnerability, especially to adolescent women. I think that's a nuance we need to explore more, and the issue of intergenerational inequality coupled with gender disparity. So thank you so much for that comment on the film, and thank you everyone for attending today. I have seen people from all over the world. This is a topic that concerns us all. Thank you very much, and you can find more in our policy brief, and the film will also be available if you should want to see it again. Thank you so much.